Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today's day 7. And let's start by talking about names. We've practiced this a bit already. Let's look first at a poster, a very famous one. Родина мать зовет. Родина means homeland. Mать, as we've seen, means mother. So Родина мать means something like the motherland or the mother homeland, however you want to translate. It's just a hyphenated term, obviously. Well, that's our subject. We can tell by looking at Rodina, right? We can see that's in the nominative, so that's going to be acting as a subject. And then we have a verb, zaviot. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about verbs in this chapter, but we're just using very simple expressions. And we've seen already that this verb means to call. And here we're using it in a non-idiomatic way, right? The motherland calls, the motherland summons, right? But for now we're going to be using that verb mostly in this little expression, meaning how do they call you, right? Remember the Russian idiom for talking about what is your name, what is the person's name, what do they call you or him or whatever. So let's review that little idiom. Как вас зовут? What do they call you? That would be a вы expression. Как тебя зовут? How do they call you? That would be a ты expression. And then we get what we practiced the other day. Меня зовут Ivan. Me, they call Ivan or whatever. Okay, so you see we've got some forms of pronouns that we've practiced a little bit, but we didn't really explain what they were. Those are the accusative forms of pronouns. So let's now add a third column to our little pronoun table. And this is already getting a little bit complicated. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves just to be able to say some very simple things by giving, in this case, the accusative form of these pronouns. But we're not going to learn the full set of genitive and accusative endings until chapter 2. So for now, let's review what we know so far. In the singular, we've got the pronouns ya, ты, and then on, ana, ano. We've got these u expressions that we practiced yesterday, at me, at you, etc. U there is a preposition. It means at, and it's followed by the genitive case. So what we're seeing there are actually genitive forms. У меня, у тебя, у него, у нее, у него. Remember that v pronunciation. It's not у него, it's у него. If we look in the plural, we've got мы, вы, они. Note, by the way, that Russian does not distinguish gender in the plural. That's actually some good news. A lot of Slavic languages still do. Russian doesn't, right? So они works for any gender in the plural. So we had the u expressions, у нас, at us, у вас, at you, or at you polite, or at you plural, and у них, right, at them. Okay, our new forms today, the accusative forms, we're a little bit lucky because they're basically identical to the genitive forms we were using with u, right? Меня, тебя, его, ее, его. Right? The only difference we notice is that for the third persons, right, after u, we get a form that begins with an n, and that's typical for pronouns that would otherwise begin with a ye or an e. They add an n following any preposition. Maybe one day I'll tell you why that is. I think it's a bit early to do that right now, but it reaches very, very far back into the history of the language. Today it just kind of looks like sort of an oddity. Anyway, and look at in the plural, right? The forms are again almost identical. Nas, vas, and finally ich. Right? Again, note that the n is not appearing here in the simple accusative form. Okay, so what do we use the accusative case for? Well, we're going to talk a lot more about that next chapter, but as you might know, it's used for direct objects, right? So if we're buying something, or we're writing something, or we're cooking something, right? That something is the direct object of the verb. How do we know what word is a direct object in Russian? Well, as with anything, we look at the case ending, we look at the form of the word, and we see that, okay, that word is in the accusative case. That must mean that it's acting as a direct object. And that's what we're getting in this little idiom, right? Again, we're not saying my name is X. We're saying they call me, they call you, they call her, they call him, right? The pronoun me, her, him, etc. is the direct object of the verb zavut. Okay, so let's practice this here a little bit. Just filling in the proper forms for this little series of sentences. Let's say, what's her name, right? We're talking about Anna. Как ее зовут? Как ее зовут? How her they call. Let's ask similarly, how is she doing? How at her things? Как у нее дела? There we need the N. Как у нее дела? Очень хорошо, right? Very, very good. Things are going very well for her. Let's say she has a new lamp. At her is new lamp. У нее есть новая лампа. Два. Они, right? Let's talk about them. Как их зовут? How do they call them? Как у них дела? How at them things? Очень хорошо. У них есть новый шампунь. They've got new shampoo, right? Things are going great. Okay, number three. We're talking about ты, right? You, informal. How do they call you? Как тебя зовут? How at you are things. Как у тебя дела? Очень хорошо. У меня есть новое одеяло. Right? Let's assume this is a little dialogue and let's say, well, things are going great. I've got a new blanket. У меня есть новое одеяло. Let's look briefly at some spelling rules. These are rather tricky. It's one of those things, on the one hand, it's easy to tell what's going on here, but getting used to it and is a different matter. It may take some time to get used to. But essentially, in Russian, there are three things that we might call spelling rules. Now, in some ways, that term isn't very good because it makes it sound like it's just some spelling convention that doesn't really have anything to do with anything really. But always keep in mind when we say spelling rules, the spelling is reflecting the pronunciation. So it's not just a matter of some spelling convention in terms of telling us what letter combinations can't be written. It's really also about what sound combinations simply do not occur in Russian. So we have three of these. We're going to learn two of them in this chapter, actually today. And they're going to just kind of bedevil us here for a little while until we get used to them. Eventually, you'll just stop even thinking about it. So what do these rules tell us? Again, let's think of it in terms of spelling. They basically tell us that we can't write certain letters next to each other. Certain combinations of letters can't occur. So first, the rule tells us what we can't write. And secondly, it tells us what we write instead, right? So whenever we would go to normally write some combination that's forbidden, instead we write something else. Okay, so we have two of these we're going to use today. The first is a 7-letter rule, and then we also have a 5-letter rule. Okay, this can get a little confusing. As the first rule suggests, the 7-letter rule, there are 8 letters in total that are involved in these spelling rules. 8 letters in total. And this, again, it's helpful if you really think about what's going on here instead of just memorizing it by rote. Right, these 8 letters involve 4 hushing consonants. What's a hushing? Well, think sh, right? Sh, this kind of hushing quality to the consonant. You can probably guess what those are. Zh, ch, sh, sh, right? Then after that, we have a term that's a little bit harder to learn, a velar. So kind of a technical term, a velar is basically a sound made in your throat. These are kind of important for various reasons, but today, again, we're just worried about the spelling rules. The 3 velars are g, k, ch, right? So make those sounds g, k, ch, and you can see clearly that you're making them in your throat. Those are the 3 velars. And then we've got one letter, I call it the odd man out just because it's all by itself. It's not grouped with others, and that is ts, ts, right? So we've got 4 hushings, 3 velars, and the odd man out, 4, 3, and 1. Okay, so each of the 3 spelling rules is going to involve some combination of those letters. So the 7-letter rule, well, how do we get 7? Well, 4 plus 3, right? So the 4 hushings plus the 3 velars, those are the letters involved in the 7-letter spelling rule. In the 5-letter rule, right, 4 plus 1, that's okay, the 4 hushings plus this odd man out s. Okay, so the 7-letter rule tells us that after these 7 letters, the 4 hushings, the 3 velars, we cannot write I, right? Even though we might expect to write it, and we'll see examples here in a moment, we can't ever write that. Instead, we write E, right? So after these 7 letters, we write E instead of I. Similarly, with the 5-letter rule, after the 4 hushings or after the odd man out, s, we can't write unstressed or. Instead, we write yeah. Okay, this is probably the hardest spelling rule because, as you can see, it's not simply a matter of spelling. It's also, we have to worry about stress, right? It's not that we can never write an or after these letters. The issue is that we can't write an unstressed or. Again, we're seeing how important stress is. It comes up everywhere, basically. So anyway, we'll see examples of this and you'll see what we mean. But those are the 2 spelling rules. We'll add one more, I believe, next chapter. That'll be the 8-letter spelling rule. Okay, by the way, a good tip. Не суши у огня вымытую бензином одежду. Don't dry at a flame washed with gasoline clothing. Okay, so I'm just again translating word for word there, basically. Yeah, if you clean your clothes with gasoline, don't dry that near an open flame, especially when you're wearing it. So this is, by the way, one of the more amusing genres of Soviet propaganda posters, work safety posters. A lot of them are really quite grotesque. People getting maimed and injured and they're on fire or being electrocuted and things like this. So hope you appreciate that kind of humor because you're going to get a lot of it in this book. Okay, so let's look at just some ordinary adjectives, right? Nothing really weird going on at all in terms of spelling or anything. Masculines are going to end in y kratkaya, y. Feminines in a, ya, and neuters in o, yeah. But remember, for the feminines and neuters, if those endings aren't stressed, they're going to be reduced, and so they sound very different than the way they're written, and they actually sound almost alike, right? So let's go through a few of these and повторите, пожалуйста. Новый, новая, новая. Старый, старая, старая. Скучный, скучная, скучная. Любимый, любимая, любимая. Трудный, трудная, трудная. Странный, странная, странная. Чистый, чистая, чистая. Грязный, грязная, грязная. Дешевый, дешевая, дешевая. Ужасный, ужасная, ужасная. Огромный, огромная, огромная. Отличный, отличная, отличная. Безобразный, безобразная, безобразная. Важный, важная, важная. And here we have a few that we could negate. With adjectives, sometimes you can add a "nya" directly to the adjective, right, to create an antonym. But let's say pretty. Красивый, красивая, красивая. Обычный, обычная, обычная. Интересный, интересная, интересная. Okay, so those are just ordinary hard adjectives. Let's just fill in a few. Again, we have to look at the noun. We're describing it with an adjective. The adjective needs to agree with the gender. So, один, a new book. Okay, quiz yourself. Новая книга. Два, a new museum. Новый музей. Три, a new shirt. Новая рубашка. Четыре, платье, a new dress. Новое платье. Now again, as I mentioned, in a Russian classroom, if we needed to make the spelling clear, we could say новое платье, right? And that makes clear новое, right? If we don't reduce, we can hear clearly what we're actually writing. But again, no one would say that. They would say новое, and it's hard to tell if you don't know what's really being written there. But that's a neuter noun, of course. Пять, number 5, a new backpack. Новый рюкзак. 6, a new idea. Новая идея. Okay, let's use старый. 7, an old ball. Старый мяч. 8, a new room. Sorry, an old room. Старая комната. 9, an old dictionary. Старый словарь. 10, an old blanket. Старое одеяло. Again, старое одеяло. 11, an old poster. Старый плакат. 12, an old car. Старая машина. And let's use интересный. 13, an interesting question. Интересный вопрос. 14, an interesting answer or response. Интересный ответ. 15, an interesting problem, like a math problem or something, or task. Интересная задача. 16, an interesting story. This word история can mean history or it can mean simply a story. Интересная история. Of course, Russian history is extremely interesting. If you're a history buff, obviously there's a lot to read about there. 17, an interesting place. This word can mean simply place. It can also mean a seat, like in the theater or something. Интересное место. Again, note the spelling. Интересное. Интересное место. 18, an interesting picture or painting. Интересная картина. Okay, now let's look at some other adjectives that are affected by spelling rules, right? The spelling rules we just went over earlier. Let's now see how they work in action. So on the one hand, there's nothing really unusual about these adjectives, but the issue is that some of the endings, the way we write them and the way we say them and so forth, are affected by the spelling rules. And those forms are in the black boxes. In this textbook, always watch out for these black boxes, like in tables, that either it's just pointing out something noteworthy, it may be something new, or in most cases, it's something that's tricky, right? Something that's a little bit out of the ordinary. In this case, the forms that are affected by the spelling rule. All the other forms we see are just like the ones we just saw. So if the adjectival stem happens to end in one of these letters that we talked about, one of those 8 letters that are involved with spelling rules, then that could affect some of the endings we write. Look at the first 3. Маленький, легкий, русский. Those stems all end in a velar. Remember, the 7-letter rule tells us we can't write "u" after a velar, right? So instead of the "u" that we would expect for masculine adjectives, right? The 7-letter spelling rule is telling us we can't write "u." Instead, we write "e." And that's what we say as well, right? We don't say маленький, right? Instead, маленький, right? И краткое. But we see that the other endings aren't affected at all, right? Because we're not trying to write anything that would violate a spelling rule. Okay, there's one adjective that has two forms affected, and it's a very common one, хороший, meaning good. Okay, we see that stem happens to end in a hushing consonant, a sh, and so that's going to invoke both the 5 and the 7-letter spelling rule. Look at the masculine form. We would expect to see y, и краткое, but we can't write y after the hushing. Instead, we write e, and the form we end up with is хороший, хороший. Feminine is not affected, хорошая, but the neuter, now let's think, what would we normally write there? We would write o, yeah, but that o is not stressed. Okay, so normally we would be trying to write an unstressed o here. The 5-letter spelling rule is what tells us that we can't have that. Instead of the unstressed o, we write yeah. And that gives us хорошая, хорошая. Right, so that shows you how these spelling rules work. Now, you should hopefully try to learn those rules. But of course, another way to do that is just to look at these examples and see how those rules play out in actual concrete examples. Ultimately, that may be more useful. Right? Okay, so let's look at a few of these and be careful about what you're writing. Let's describe some things as русский. Okay, so that k, that velar, the 7-letter spelling rule is going to affect how we spell the masculine endings. Okay, so один, a Russian poster. Русский плакат. Два, a Russian book. Русская книга. 3, a Russian TV series. Русский сериал. 4, a Russian car. Русская машина. 5, a Russian last name. Русская фамилия. 6, number 6. Okay, watch out for this one. This is a neuter. It doesn't look like it, but it's a neuter. Русское имя, right? Русское имя. 7, number 7. Let's now use маленький, right? Small. And again, we've got that K at the end, the ka. So watch the masculine endings. A small mistake. Маленькая ошибка. 8, a small umbrella. Маленький зонт. 9, small window. Маленькое окно. 10, a small family. Маленькая семья. 11, small rug. Маленький ковер. 12, small table. Маленький стол. Now let's use хороший. Okay, be especially cautious with this one, right? The masculine and neuter forms are going to be affected by the spelling rules. 13, a good museum. Хороший музей. 14, a good idea. Хорошая идея. 15, a good spot, a good place, a good seat. Хорошее место. Okay, watch the spelling. Yeah. Хорошее место. 16, good work. Хорошая работа. 17, a good question. Хороший вопрос. 18, a good dictionary. Хороший словарь. Okay, one last type of adjective to talk about today. So we've seen just ordinary adjectives. We've seen some adjectives that are, affected by the spelling rules. And finally, we have a special class of adjectives. There aren't too many of them, but some of them are very important, and they are unstressed adjectives. Okay, that means exactly what it sounds like it means, right? It means that the adjectival endings are always stressed. Look at the masculine ending. Instead of y, right, we have this special ending for unstressed adjectives. The masculine ends in oy. Now, if we look over the feminine and the neuter, the endings are the same. The only issue is they're stressed, right? So the endings are all stressed. Let's read out a few here. Плохой, плохая, плохое. Now, because these endings are stressed, you don't get as much reduction, and so it's much clearer with these, whether it's feminine or neuter. You can tell just by hearing it. Большой, большая, большое. Expensive. Дорогой, дорогая, дорогое. A different, another. Другой, другая, другое. Funny, смешной, смешная, смешное. Okay, so as you're studying the vocab for this chapter, be sure and distinguish these in-stressed adjectives and note how they sound, right, and how the spelling is affected. Okay, so let's use большой. Again, oi is the ending we need on the masculine forms. A big backpack. Один. Большой рюкзак. Два. A big problem. Большая проблема. Три. A big rug. Большой ковер. Четыре. A big window. Большое окно. Пять. Expensive soap. Дорогое мыло. Шесть. Expensive shampoo. Дорогой шампунь. Семь. Expensive paper. Дорогая бумага. Восемь. Eight. An expensive pen. Дорогая ручка. Девять. Number 9, let's use плохой, bad, a bad day. Плохой день. 10, a bad week. Плохая неделя. 11, a bad newspaper. Плохая газета. 12, number 12, bad soap. Плохое мыло. So there's another in-stressed adjective, какой, which is a question word, and it means something like what kind of. So we can ask a какой question and presumably get adjectives in response, right? So what kind of a backpack is it? Well, it's old, nice, big, whatever, right? Just keep in mind that какой is itself an in-stressed adjective, so it works just like большой or плохой, right? Какой, какая, какое. Those are the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. So look at some examples here. Какой это film? Okay, note that we're asking what kind of film, right? We're using the pointing word. We're pointing. Now keep in mind, we may be pointing not in the literal sense, right? But kind of, we're talking about something and we're asking about it, and the eta is pointing, whether literally or figuratively, at something. Right? So какой is modifying film, therefore it's masculine. Какой это film? Это русский фильм. Он интересный? Да, очень интересный. So there's a little mini dialogue. We're asking about something, and you see how, look at the arrows, how all of the adjectives here, and the pronouns as well, are agreeing with whatever noun we're talking about. So that's very important in Russian. No matter what we're talking about, again, it could be a person, an animal, or a thing. We've always got to be thinking, what gender is it? And everything we say about it has got to agree with that gender. Let's look at a feminine example. Какая это книга? Это русская книга. Она трудная? Нет, не очень трудная. Okay. Now, a neuter example. Какое это пальто? What kind of coat? Neuter. Это русское пальто. Оно дорогое? Is it expensive? Нет, дешевое. Okay, so neuter agreement across the board there. So try filling in the blanks here and talk about your own things, right? First, let's ask a question. What kind of phone do you have or whatever? New or old or whatever, and pick one. Какой у тебя телефон? Новый или старый? Телефон у меня новый. Or старый, right? Masculine agreement. Let's ask about your schedule. Какое у тебя расписание? Трудное или легкое? Okay, we need neuters. Расписание у меня трудное, right? I've got a hard schedule, I'm guessing. Backpack. Какой у тебя рюкзак? What kind of backpack do you have? Чистый или грязный? Clean or dirty? Рюкзак у меня чистый. Right, I've got a clean backpack. Какая у тебя семья? What kind of family do you have? Большая или маленькая? Семья у меня маленькая, for example. Какой у тебя шампунь? What's your shampoo like? I'm dying to know. Дорогой или дешевый? Expensive or cheap? Шампунь у меня дешевый. Inexpensive. Okay, one more feminine example. Какая у тебя книга? What's your book like? Интересная или скучная? Книга у меня интересная. We can also use какой in exclamations. For example, какая хорошая идея? Какой большой зонт? Какая у тебя грязная комната? And again, you see the agreement across the board. Whatever noun we're talking about, we've got to have everything agreeing with it. Here are a few of these little expressions that are quite common. Some of these are extremely common. For example, какой ужас? What horror, right? Russians say that all the time. Something bad happens. They hear about something bad. Какой ужас? Какой кошмар, right? Also very common. What a nightmare. By the way, кошмар is borrowed from French, if you know any French. Какая ерунда? What nonsense. Какое безобразие? What hideousness? What a mess. Какой идиот? What an idiot. Какая разница? What's the difference? Okay, so разница is a difference. Okay, so anyway, those are a few expressions with какой that are extremely common. You might want to, those are well worth learning, by the way, even though we won't really be using them too often. Those are really common expressions. Okay, so let's make a few of these какой expressions, right? These sort of exclamations, right? Let's say, what an expensive and big car. Машина, right? Feminine. Какая дорогая и большая машина. Два. What an old and interesting poster. Какой старый и интересный плакат. Three. What a beautiful and unusual dress. Какое красивое и необычное платье. Четыре. What a good and clean cafeteria. Какой хороший и чистый кафетерий. Пять. What a terrible and boring movie. Какой ужасный и скучный фильм. Шесть. What an unusual and interesting idea. Какая необычная и интересная идея. Семь. What an old and hideous photograph. Какая старая и безобразная фотография. Восемь. What a small and dirty window. Какое маленькое и грязное окно. Okay, let's end today with a quick note. First of all, let's look at a poster, which has a nice example. This is an anti-religion poster, so that's kind of another subgenre of these propaganda posters. Of course, theoretically, the Marxism and communism was anti-religion. They sort of tolerated churches, but also persecuted the clergy and so on and so forth. And generally speaking, being religious was definitely not encouraged, to put it mildly. And here's an example of that. You see this kind of retrograde old granny, and religious people in those days were often depicted this way as kind of a dying breed and very retrograde, and they need to yield the past to the new generation. And here's an old grandma who wants to drag her little pioneer granddaughter to the church, to this crumbling church there. By the way, the Bolsheviks destroyed a lot of churches, including some really famous ones. A lot of them, for example, in Petersburg, where There used to be a large church. There's now a subway station. Um, anyway, but that's a topic for another day. I shouldn't get into it. Anyway, the girl wants to go to the school, right? So she wants to be educated, but her grandma doesn't let her. Okay, so anyway, the caption reads, Religia yads, birigi rebiat. And that's a little rhyming couplet, actually. And it's kind of interesting because you see the second word there, the line ending is rebiat. And note how that rhymes with yads perfectly, right? Because the D is devoiced. So that's a nice little example there of devoicing of final consonants in action. But anyway, our main concern here is omission of the linking verb is. And we mentioned this already, that Russian by default will omit the linking verb is. Of course, if you had a plural subject, that would also be are, right? Is, are, whatever that linking verb is omitted by default. Sometimes, often in somewhat formal contexts, the linking verb, you may see a long dash standing in for the linking verb. Now in this poster, it looks like just a short little hyphen, but that's just kind of a matter of the typography here. It's normally a long dash, and that can sometimes be kind of a placeholder, kind of a visual placeholder for the omitted linking verb. Okay, so again, we would read this as religion is poison, right? And again, we set, when we're translating into English, we would have to supply a verb normally. So religion is poison, protect children. Okay, a few other quick examples here. Какая у тебя машина? What kind of car do you have? Well, here this question is assuming that the car exists, right? We assume that there is a car. Moreover, that there is a car at you, right? That you have a car. And we're simply asking what kind of car is it? But because the is isn't really the point of this question, it's omitted, right? The is understood. And kind of a similar question, машина у тебя новая, right? Kind of the same issue. But if we're asking about existence, right? For example, у тебя есть красная ручка? Do you have a red pen? Okay, so the issue here isn't, what color is your pen really? We're asking specifically about a red pen. Do you have it, right? Does it exist at you, so to speak? Okay, so in any situation like that where the есть is kind of the point where it's being emphasized for whatever reason, Russian does include the есть. So let's look at a couple of other examples. Here's an example of this long dash I mentioned. Моя любимая русская книга «Война и мир». Right, so there's kind of a longer sentence, somewhat formal, and you see that the long dash is kind of a placeholder there. You could flip that around sort of. «Война и мир» — это великий русский роман. And that's kind of a definition. Again, kind of formal. You're naming something, long dash, followed by «это», and then you go on to explain whatever that thing is. So again, a somewhat formal little type of sentence, kind of giving a definition, and we get that long dash cropping up. Okay, so that's it for today. Until tomorrow, до свидания, товарищи.